Good afternoon, my name is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and we're going to begin episode 4 of The Road to Andersonville. So on this first slide right here, you can see some of the gravestones of the soldiers that died at Andersonville. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, of the soldiers that we talked about, you can see in Connecticut, first column on the left, we've talked about 13 soldiers. Massachusetts, 4, and Rhode Island, 4. Reason we had a lot on Connecticut is because they all got captured at Plymouth, North Carolina, altogether. Now, in the red, I put those that actually survived Andersonville. So you got First Sergeant Silas Norton, Private James Chapman, Private Doran Satwater, Private William Walker, Private David Dean, and Private Andrew Durfee. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, I put this together here, Connecticut Soldiers photos. It's hard to get pictures of all the different soldiers, and I was lucky to come across these. Of course, you got Private James Strawn on the left, Doran Satwater in the middle, and the newest one I just got was Private William Dutton. And I've got his picture, actually, of this book right here called Andersonville, A Southern Perspective, which is, of all places, you probably wouldn't think you'd have a Union soldiers' pictures in there, but I got that one there, so it's kind of a new discovery I had this week. So we'll go to the next slide. And these are all the ones of that group that we've talked about that actually didn't make it out of Andersonville. So this is, of course, a tribute to them. We'll go to the next slide. Now, we're going to talk about Private Charles Curtis. He was in the 5th Rhode Island Artillery. We haven't talked about him at all. If you take a look at his headstone, you're going to wonder how come he doesn't have a number on it. And after I tell his story, you will understand why. First of all, he was mustered in Providence, Rhode Island. He's what they call a bonus jumper. Soldiers were paid a bonus if they enlisted. So he would go to a town, we'll say in Rhode Island, enlist, get his $500, we'll say, bonus. And before he goes and reports for active duty, he would never do that. Then he would go to another town and enlist again and get another $500, and then he wouldn't report to duty. So he was quite the individual there. And he was also a deserter. He deserted from the Union Army and then was captured by the Confederates in Morehead City, North Carolina, and taken down to Andersonville, Georgia, where he became what is known as a Raider chieftain. So we'll go with the next slide. Now, the Raiders were a group of inmates, actually, at Andersonville. And what they would do is they would prey on others. When they came into the camps, they would, at night, go into their shebangs and by knife point, grab anything they had, any money, any food, anything they had, especially the new recruits, the new captors that came into the camp. They would terrorize all the fellow prisoners, and they robbed the prisoners at knife point. In many instances, killed them to get whatever they could. And once again, they murdered anyone who resisted. And it was really getting out of control here in Andersonville because the guards were only on the outside. The Confederate guards never patrolled inside. So in order to maintain any semblance of order, it was strictly up to those that are inside the prison camp to do that. And the leaders are Collins and Curtis from Rhode Island. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, these are the 6 Raider leaders, and they're all buried in a separate part of the cemetery. Patrick Delaney from Pennsylvania, Charles Curtis from Rhode Island, William Collins from Pennsylvania, John Sarsfield from New York, W. Rickson, and A. Munn. The last 2 were in the Navy. all Union soldiers. And we'll go to the next slide. And so the commander of Captain Wirtz said, you got to discipline yourselves. So they had a trial. And on July 11th, 1864, all 6 were sentenced to death because they had killed many of the inmates, and there was an uprising in Andersonville. And what's interesting in history here, when I did some reading, Charles Curtis, you can see him, he's one of the 6 standing up on the platform there with a noose around his head. When they dropped the trap door, his rope broke and he fell down to the ground, dusted himself off, and tried to run away. And now you got to remember, there's probably at that point maybe 26,000 prisoners there. He tried to get through the crowd to get away. He got pretty far. They tackled him. They brought him back, brought him up on top, put the noose around his head, and the second time they were successful. So that's the story of Charles Curtis. Go to the next slide. And you can see they're all together, all 6 separate from the rest of the cemetery. And because they were all deserters, they were all murderers, they didn't have any numbers on their tombstones. And when they put American flags, for instance, on Veterans Day, or some of the military holidays, they would never put any American flags on these. They would put them on the over 12,000 others, each one of the graves, but these definitely aren't done. No flags on the graves, ever. Go to the next slide. Now, I thought this was a great picture of, we're talking about August 1864. At that time, that's when they had, the month when they had the most prisoners. Over 33,000 prisoners were there. And you got to remember, the original design was only for 10,000. And that's a great painting. You can see how it was. We'll go to the next slide. And this is a photograph, not too many, but there's a photograph inside, actual photograph. And all these folks were at Andersonville. And during the month of August, they averaged 100 prisoners died per day. They had been in captivity for many months. A lot of them died at the hand of the raiders, and mostly natural for diseases and that type of thing. We'll go to the next slide. Some tried to escape. Look at this picture here. They were given the okay to try to dig some wells for fresh water. And a lot of them used that as an excuse to start making a tunnel to get out. It was really not much of a chance of doing this, but according to history, there was 325 attempts to escape. Only 32 were successful. And you can see today that picture up on the right was probably either one of the wells or one of the tunnels. So they were trying to do anything to get out of Andersonville. We'll go to the next slide. Now, Private James Chapman, he's from Connecticut, from the 11th Connecticut Infantry. And he successfully escaped. But we did some research, and we found out that the time he escaped was later in the prison. And it probably escaped in what they call a work detail. You can see the burying detail. They had some of the inmates would go out the gates, and they would unload the bodies from the wagon and put them all in the trench. And one way or another, he successfully escaped. And Dorrance Atwater's picture over there, he was with everyone here because he had to write down and identify all the soldiers one by one as they were placed in the trench and keep a record of that. Go to the next slide. And the 16th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. They were captured at Plymouth, North Carolina, and sent to Andersonville. And those are the graves that they actually died in Andersonville. Many of them, of course, they're all from Connecticut. So you can see we've kind of honored them and put that all together right here. Go to the next slide. Now, Private Henry Burke, he was from the 16th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, captured at Plymouth, North Carolina, with the rest of those from Connecticut. And one way or another, for whatever reason, he was in the deadline, which you mentioned before. He was tried to cross the deadline. We actually have that documented on the Andersonville records. And he was actually shot on August 4th, 1864. Once again, August was when they had the most prisoners in the camp. Now, he didn't die from his wounds then, but he died very shortly thereafter. So they probably pulled him back out of the deadline and try to help them the best they could. Because anyone that came across that 15-foot space there, all the Confederate guards were ordered shoot to kill. And that's a famous painting there over on the right, and there's a deadline over on the left, just as it would look like. So we'll go to the next slide. Civil War Hospital crutches. I got those pictures there. There's a, you can see this picture there on the left. There's a Civil War nurse, and you can see the two crutches there. And you can see actual crutches, which they had, during the medicine detachments or whatever during the Civil War over there. And if you take a close look at those, you can see how they're shaped, and they're all handmade, and they're all different. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, Private James Strawn, 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, and there's a picture of the crutches that they were used during the Civil War up on the top. There's a picture of his crutch, and on the bottom is a picture of the top of the crutch. We have that. We found that in the family, and there's somewhat of a mystery to it. It looks like he may have used that when he broke his leg before he was in the Union Army. But we'll never know. When you die in Andersonville, others would take your crutch. Maybe somebody from Connecticut brought it back for him after they were released from the prison. We will never know it. But I have it right here. It's quite a piece of history for the family. May not be able to see it that well. Let me get it over here. Okay. Now the important part is you can see how the end of it was made. What they did is they chiseled out, and then they chiseled out the shaft, and then they assembled it that way. So we feel very confident it's period at the Civil War and the type of crutch. And he also carved on it. I broke my leg, but he put the date. But it's hard to read the date on it. But it's a part of our history. So I'm glad I have it. We'll go to the next slide. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures. When my wife went down there at 2016, I wanted to take a picture of the trenches where they were all laid shoulder to shoulder and then filled in. So we found the cemetery of James Strawn. We found his headstone. You can see it right there. And what I did is I took this picture on the right. I told my wife, she's got the red shirt on, to go down in front of his grave, and I'll snap the picture there just to give a perspective of how many soldiers are in front and exactly where he died. Got home to Connecticut, went through my books, took a second look, and I couldn't believe it. On the left there's the actual historical picture of the open trench landing, putting all the bodies in. And Dorrance Atwood, of course, was there in that picture somewhere. taking account of all those that died. And take a look at the trees lying in the back of that, and then take a look at the tree lines in the back of my photo. And I did some more research just recently, and they said in August, I think it was August 14th or so, that's when they dug this particular trench. And of course, James died on August 2nd, I guess, 1864. So there's a good possibility that was the actual location in history. So I think this one slide says it all and preserves it for our family. Go to the next slide. Now, let's do some comparison here. Civil War POW death camps. Northern prison camps, you had Camp Douglas, Rock Island, Illinois, Elmira, New York, Camp Morton, Indiana, and Johnson Island, Ohio. And the total Confederates that died there were 11,361 of all those different prison camps. The southern prison camps, you can see Andersonville, 12,920, succeeds every single one of those. Florence, South Carolina, and then Salisbury, North Carolina. So there's a total of 19,371 Union soldiers died in captivity and 11,361 Confederates. That was quite interesting when you take a look at that perspective. We'll go to the next slide. And what did they actually die from, the 12,912? I found in a book they actually kept records of that. We'll go down the list: chronic diarrhea, scurvy, dysentery, gangrene, anasarca, pneumonia. A lot of these are medical names. Debilitus, gunshot wounds, of course, with the guards, bronchitis, rheumatism, sunstroke, they're all left out in the heat in Georgia. Jaundice, nostalgia just went crazy being there. Hanging, of course, those are the 6 raiders. And the list goes on. Laryngitis, asthma, smallpox, unknown, 470. Once again, hanging 6. There's a total of 12,912. Roll the next slide. And there's a picture of one of the sections of the cemetery. Now those from New England, because the story is New England history, from Connecticut, 315 are buried here. Maine, 233. Massachusetts, 768. New Hampshire, 124. And Rhode Island, 74. So there's 1,509 Union soldiers from New England that are buried here in Andersonville. And that's, you can see how close they were buried and how close the actual headstones are. So we'll go to the next slide. And let's take the list of some of the soldiers we talked about. Noah Chapman, he died in August. James Strawn, he died in August. Silas Norton survived. William Barnum survived. James Chapman escaped. Dorrance Atwater survived. In Rhode Island, Patrick Carpenter died. Caleb Hunt died. Charles Curtis, of course, was hanged. And Andrew Durfee survived. Massachusetts, Philip Murphy died. Charles Torrey died. William Walker died. And David Dean survived. So that's part of our New England story right here. We'll go to the next slide. Now, everything happened at the end of the war. All these, it's good to put this in context to see what was going on here. In April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant McLean House in Virginia. That's the picture of the house right there. And there's a famous painting, Lee shaking hands with Grant. So the Civil War was over. Go to the next slide. And April 14th, you can see from April 9th they surrendered. April 14th, President Lincoln went in Washington, D.C., went to Ford's Theater to see a play. We'll go to the next slide. And of course, Lincoln was shot on April 14th, 1865. And that's the balcony there. Lincoln was on the top of the balcony there, and John Wilkes Booth came in the back door, shot him in the back of the head. Then John Wilkes Booth jumped off the balcony in front of all those in the audience, hurt his leg when he fell, ran across the stage, and began his escape. Go to the next slide. Now, right after that, President Lincoln was removed. His body was removed from the balcony, taken across the street to what they call the Peterson House. There's a picture of it there over on the right. They wanted to get him into a room for possible medical attention. Go to the next slide. And there's a New England story right here. One room was vacant, and that was rented out to William T. Clark. He was the 11th Massachusetts Infantry, and that was his room. It was after the war, and he rented that room, but he was away at the time of Lincoln was shot. So since he wasn't in the room, they opened the door, and they put Lincoln down, and that's the actual photograph I took inside that room where Lincoln died on April 14th. We'll go to the next slide. Then, at the same time, a lot of the prisoners were leaving Andersonville and some of the other southern prisoner of war camps. A lot of them were sent from Andersonville to other camps at the end of the war to empty out Andersonville. And a lot of them made it onto what they call the Sultana. It's a riverboat. It's on the Mississippi River, and they all got on there in Vicksburg. The capacity of the Sultana for passengers was 376. Now, they made deals with the captain of the ship. In other words, the more soldiers he could get on that, the more money he would make. So he said, no problem, I can cram more than 376 and take them up the Mississippi. I can get so much more money. So he actually, 2,100 Union soldiers got on that ship. There's a picture of the Sultana. Not only that, at Vicksburg, the boilers were going maintenance. And he found that one of the boilers, steam boilers, had a crack in it. Now, to repair it correctly was going to take some time, and the captain would lose money because all the prisoners are ready to get on the ship to get out. So he said, okay, he authorized a temporary repair to the cracks on the boilers. 2,100 Union soldiers got on there. And of course, you got to remember, after Andersonville, they were so weak. I mean, they weighed, all of them probably under 100 pounds. They could just about made it stand up or whatever. And they got on there on their way to freedom. They got home. We'll go to the next slide. Now, at the same time, on April 26th, see, we said the Sultana was leaving Vicksburg, heading north into Mississippi, but on April 26th, John Wilkes Booth was escaping through Virginia. He got into the Garrett house in the backyard. There was a barn, and they got him holed up there in the barn. And our Union soldiers surrounded him, and they killed him on April 26, 1865. And this is important. You'll see when I go to the next slide. I'll go to the next slide. April 27th, early in the morning. Now, the 26th, John Wilkes Booth was captured and killed. Made all the papers across the country. Early that following morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, all the boilers exploded in the middle of the Mississippi River. And what happened is the boilers on the fire tubes needed water, of course, to heat the water for the boilers. And what happened was there were so many soldiers on it that the ship was actually tipping from side to side as they moved around, side to side, side to side. And if you know anything about boilers, what was happening is the water would slush to one side of the one side of the boiler and expose all the hot pipes, and then slush back and forth. You're supposed to keep the pipes all covered in water, and that's what set it off, plus the crack that wasn't repaired properly. So we'll go to the next slide. And the whole thing just blew up right in the middle of the Mississippi River. Now, all the soldiers, I mean, they couldn't swim, they couldn't even walk. I mean, surviving Andersonville was a complete disaster. This is right around Memphis, Tennessee. So we'll go to the next slide. Some were buried here that they identified at the cemetery in Memphis. And just compare that to it's the largest maritime disaster in United States history even today. I just ranked 4 of these famous ones. The Sultana had 1,800 died in 1865. The next was the Titanic, 1,514 in 1912. Then the Lusitania, 1,198 in 1915. And of course, the Arizona at Pearl Harbor, 1,177 in 1941. Now, the reason nobody knows about it is because when Lincoln was shot, John Wilkes Booth was finally captured. That made all the papers, and it was hardly even reported. And the Sultana disaster was essentially lost to history. And this book right here, if you want to read it, The Sultana Tragedy, excellent, excellent book. It tells everything about what happened here, the soldiers from Andersonville and everything. And I read that book, and it's an incredible story to read of what happened to a lot of those soldiers that actually survived Andersonville. So once again, this is Dave Norton. We're going to continue. Episode 5 will be in a couple of weeks. And I hope you enjoyed this history. And once again, have a good evening from Discovering New England History.